I buried my wife on a Thursday in March, and by the following Tuesday I told my son I needed to get away for a few days. Not far. Just 3 nights at my brother's cabin up near the lake, where the phone barely worked and nobody would look at me with that soft, careful pity in their eyes. Frank understood. He'd lost his own wife 2 years back. He didn't ask questions, just handed me a fishing rod and a beer and let me sit on the dock in silence, which was the only thing that felt like relief anymore. My name is Walter Higgins. I'm 63 years old, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I thought I understood exactly what grief was going to cost me. I did not know it was also going to cost me my house. I'd built that house not with my own hands, not entirely, but I'd overseen every beam of it 31 years ago when Diane and I were young enough to believe we'd grow old in it together. We did grow old in it, just not together, not all the way to the end. She passed in that house, in the bedroom with the bay window she loved because the morning light hit her face just right. I couldn't look at that window anymore without my chest caving in, which is the real reason I went to Frank's. I needed 3 days, where I didn't have to walk past that room. My son Danny drove me to the airport that Tuesday morning. Danny is 31, married 4 years now to a woman named Renee, and they'd been staying with me on and off since the funeral, helping with arrangements, they said, keeping me company so I wasn't alone in that big house. I'd been grateful for it, actually. Grief makes you soft in ways you don't expect. It makes you want your children close even when some quiet part of you knows they should be building their own lives, not hovering around the edges of yours. You sure you're gonna be okay, Dad? Danny asked at the curb, and I remember thinking his voice sounded strange. Not sad. Careful. It's the way you sound when you're holding something back. I'll be fine, I told him. Watch the place while I'm gone. He said he would. He said it too fast. I didn't think anything of it then. Grief has a way of making you deaf to warning signs, because you're already braced for the worst thing that could happen and you assume it already has. The flight back landed a little after 4 in the afternoon, 3 days later, right on schedule. I drove myself home from the airport in the rental car, watching the familiar turns come up one after another. The elementary school Danny went to, the little diner Diane and I used to have breakfast at on Sundays, the long stretch of road where the trees opened up and you could see the roofline of my house peeking over the hedge. I'd been looking forward to that view. I'd been telling myself the whole drive that maybe 3 days away had done something for me, softened the edges of the grief just enough that I could walk back into that house and it would feel like mine again instead of a museum of everything I'd lost. Then I turned into the driveway, and the softness drained right out of me. There was a car I didn't recognize parked crooked across half the driveway, forcing me to pull up onto the grass just to get past it. A minivan, dented on one side, with a stack of moving boxes visible through the back windows. And behind it, blocking the garage entirely, sat a U-Haul trailer, its ramp down, its cargo area half empty like someone had been unloading it all afternoon. I sat in the rental car for a long moment with my hands on the wheel, that same cold feeling Diane used to call my gut drop spreading through my stomach. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe Danny was borrowing the garage for something. Maybe he and Renee were finally moving out of that cramped apartment they always complained about, and this was just a coincidence of timing. I got out of the car. The front door of my house was standing wide open, and even from the driveway I could hear voices inside, more voices than should have been there, laughter that didn't belong to anyone in my family, and underneath it all, the low thump of music I didn't recognize. I walked up the front path with my suitcase still in my hand, and the first person I saw was a heavyset man in his 50s I had never once laid eyes on, standing in my front hallway wrestling a recliner, not my recliner, a stranger's recliner, ugly and stained through my doorway. He grunted at me, gave me the kind of nod you give a stranger holding a door, and kept moving the chair like I wasn't even worth a second look. Excuse me, I said. Who are you? He didn't answer. He just kept pushing the recliner deeper into my living room, and that's when I saw the rest of it. My living room, the room where Diane and I had spent 31 Christmas mornings, was full of boxes stacked 3 and 4 high, unfamiliar furniture crowded in wherever there was space, and people, strangers, a woman about my age sitting on my sofa with her shoes still on, flipping through channels on my television like she'd lived there for years. A teenage boy sprawled on the floor with a phone in his face. And a younger woman I almost recognized, standing near the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed, watching all of it happen like a supervisor overseeing a job well done. My stomach dropped the rest of the way when I placed her. Renee's sister. I'd met her once, at the wedding, for maybe 10 minutes. But, Danny, I called out, my voice cracking through the noise. Danny, where are you? For a second, nobody answered. Then my son came around the corner from the kitchen, a box in his arms, and when he saw me standing in my own front hallway with my suitcase still gripped in my hand, his face went the color of old paper. Dad, he set the box down too fast, like it had suddenly become too heavy to hold. I thought your flight didn't land. Till later. I landed on time, Danny. What is going on in my house? He looked past me at the strangers filling my living room, then back at me, and I watched my grown son, a man with a mortgage and a job, and, I'd thought, a spine shrink down into something smaller than I'd ever seen him. It's Renee's family had some stuff happen. Her dad lost his job, the landlord sold the building they were renting, they got maybe 2 weeks' notice to be out. They didn't have anywhere else to go, Dad. We said they could stay here. Just for a little while. Tenure. Here, I repeated. In my house. Without asking me. We were going to call you, he said. And even as the words came out of his mouth, I could hear how thin they were, how much he didn't believe them himself. It happened so fast, and you were dealing with everything, with Mom, and we didn't want to bother you with it while you were grieving. You didn't want to bother me, I said. So instead you moved 4 strangers into the house where your mother died 3 weeks ago. He flinched like I'd struck him. Good. I wanted him to flinch, Ty. I pushed past him into the living room, and the woman on my sofa, Renee's mother, I would learn her name was Carol, glanced up at me with an expression that had no apology in it whatsoever. Just a flicker of appraisal, like she was deciding whether I was going to be a problem. You must be Walter, she said, like she was doing me a favor by knowing my name. Danny's told us so much about you. We're so sorry for your loss. I did not answer her. I turned and walked toward the kitchen. And that was worse. My kitchen, Diane's kitchen, the one she'd picked every tile for, had dishes stacked in the sink that weren't mine, a cooler sitting open on the counter dripping water onto the floor, and taped to the refrigerator. At eye level, right where Diane used to hang photos of Danny as a boy, someone had stuck a crayon drawing that belonged to a child I had never met. I stood there in the doorway and felt something in my chest go very still and very cold. Renee was standing at the stove, and when she turned and saw me, there was no surprise on her face at all. That was the detail that stuck with me later, turning it over that night unable to sleep. She wasn't surprised. She'd known exactly when I was coming home. She'd had time to prepare a face for this moment, and the face she'd prepared was calm, almost pleasant, the face of someone who had already decided how this conversation was going to go and had no intention of letting me steer it anywhere else. Walter, she said, I know this looks like a lot all at once, but I promise we would never have done this if we had another choice. You could have called me, I said. You could have asked. You were grieving, she said, in the exact careful tone Danny had used, like they'd rehearsed it. We didn't want to add to your stress. And honestly, the house has been sitting here so quiet since your wife passed. It felt wrong for it to be empty when my family needed somewhere to land. I want to tell you I had some sharp, cutting reply ready for that. I didn't. I stood in my dead wife's kitchen with a suitcase still in my hand, and all I could manage was, this isn't empty. I live here. Hess. 19. Of course you do, Renee said, in a voice you'd use on a child. Nobody's saying you don't. We just need a little time to get back on our feet. A month, maybe 2. You won't even notice we're here. I walked past her, down the hallway toward my bedroom, the one room in that house I had been dreading and craving in equal measure, because it was the last place I'd held Diane's hand. The door was open. It was never open. I always kept it shut since the funeral, like closing the door could hold the grief inside that one room and keep it from spreading through the rest of the house. It was not empty inside. There were 2 suitcases thrown open on the floor. Someone's clothes were hanging in my closet, pushed up against Diane's dresses, which I hadn't been able to bring myself to move yet. The framed photo of Diane that sat on the nightstand, the one from our anniversary trip to the coast, the one where she's laughing so hard her eyes are shut, had been moved to make room for someone else's alarm clock. I picked up that photo with both hands and I stood there in the doorway of my own bedroom, and something in me that had been bending under the weight of the last 3 weeks finally cracked all the way through. "Get them out," I said, and my voice came out low and strange even to my own ears. "Get every one of them out of my house tonight." End quote. Danny had followed me down the hallway. "Dad, please, just give it a few days. Let everyone calm down. We can talk about this like adults." I am talking like an adult," I said. "I am telling you, as the man whose name is on the deed to this house, that these people need to leave, tonight." That's when Renee's voice came from behind me, and it had lost every trace of the soft, patient tone from the kitchen. "It's not that simple anymore, Walter." I turned around. She was standing at the end of the hallway with her arms crossed, and for the first time since I'd walked in the door, I saw something in her face that wasn't performance. It was calculation. "What does that mean?" I said. "Not that simple. It means my parents have already given notice on their old apartment. It means we've told the kids' school this is their new district. It means we've been here 3 days, Walter, and there's a process now. If you want to force people out, you can't just throw people onto the street because you had a bad homecoming." "This is my house," I said again, because it felt like the only sentence I still had. "It's Danny's house too, eventually," she said. "You've always said this house would come to him someday. We're just moving that timeline up a little, getting settled before you're gone, so there's no fighting about it later." I stood there in the hallway of my own home and understood, all at once, with a clarity that felt like ice water down my spine, that I was not looking at a family in crisis. I was looking at a plan. And Diane had been dead 3 weeks. I had been out of the state for 3 days, and in that window, my daughter-in-law had decided that my grief was an opportunity. I didn't sleep in that house that night. I couldn't. I checked into a motel off the highway, the kind with a flickering vacancy sign and a bedspread that smelled like cigarettes from decades before the smoking ban, and I lay on top of the covers with my shoes still on, staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped like nothing at all. And I thought about calling the police right then. I almost did. My thumb was over the number, but something stopped me, and it wasn't fear. It was 30 years of practicing law before I retired. Commercial litigation, contract disputes, nothing dramatic, but enough to know exactly how these things could unravel if you moved too fast and too angry. If I called the police that night and told them my sons-in-laws were squatting in my house, they'd walk in, see a family with mail already arriving at that address, kids possibly already enrolled at the local school, no visible signs of forced entry, and they'd tell me exactly what I already suspected. "This is now a civil matter, sir. You'll need to file for eviction, and eviction takes time." Time was the one thing Renee was counting on me not having the patience for. So instead of calling the police, I called a man named Arthur Kessel the next morning. Arthur and I had gone to law school together 40 years ago, and while I'd spent my career in courtrooms, he'd spent his in real estate and property law, quietly becoming one of the most respected attorneys in the state for exactly this kind of mess. I sat across from him in his office, the same suitcase from my trip still in the trunk of my rental car, and I told him everything: the boxes, the strangers, the photo of Diane pushed aside for someone else's alarm clock, and Renee's voice in that hallway telling me it wasn't that simple anymore. Arthur listened without interrupting, which is a rare gift in a lawyer, and when I finished he set down his pen and looked at me for a long moment. "Walter," he said, "I'm very sorry about Diane. And a family, thank you. And I'm going to tell you something you're not going to want to hear, which is that, if this were a simple trespass, we'd have this solved in 48 hours. But it sounds like they were careful. Mail at the address, kids enrolled in school, a story about being invited, even a flimsy one, gives them just enough cover that local police are going to push this into civil court rather than treat it as a crime. And that could take weeks. And maybe longer, if they fight it, and it sounds like this daughter-in-law of yours intends to fight it. So what do I do?" I asked him. "Just let them live in my house while lawyers argue." No," Arthur said, and something shifted in his expression, something almost sharp. "You said, she told you the house would come to Danny eventually, Wanda, that she's moving up the timeline. Did she say anything else along those lines? Anything about ownership? About her having some claim to the property?" I thought back, and then I remembered something I'd nearly forgotten in the fog of that terrible evening, a stack of papers I'd glimpsed on my kitchen counter among the boxes. Papers with a bank's letterhead on them, before Renee had swept them into a folder and out of sight. There were documents, I said slowly, on the counter. I only saw them for a second. Arthur leaned forward. What kind of documents? I don't know, but she moved them fast when she saw me looking. That, Arthur said, is what we need to find out. If she's doing anything that involves representing herself as having authority over that property, using your name, forging your signature, applying for anything in your name without your consent, that's not a family dispute anymore, Walter. That's fraud. And fraud, unlike trespass, is something the police take seriously, warrant and all. I want to be honest with you about the next part, because it wasn't easy, and it wasn't something I'm proud of doing to my own son's family even now. But Arthur had a colleague, a private investigator named Rosalind Vance, sharp as anything, who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet excavation. I hired her that same afternoon. Her job was simple: find out what those papers were, and find out whether Renee's plan went any further than moving boxes into my living room. It took her 4 days. 4 days during which I did not go back to that house. I stayed at the motel, then moved to a hotel closer to town when the motel's ice machine started keeping me up at night with its rattling. Danny called me twice. Both times I let it go to voicemail, and both times the voicemail was the same: him apologizing, him saying it had gotten out of hand, him saying Renee had promised him it would only be a month or two and he hadn't thought it through, hadn't wanted to upset me right after the funeral. I believed that he was sorry. I did not believe, not for 1 second, that he hadn't known exactly what was happening before it happened. On the 5th day, Rosalind called and asked to meet in person. She laid a folder on the table between us at the diner where Diane and I used to have Sunday breakfast, which felt like its own small cruelty, having this conversation in that booth. Inside the folder were copies of documents and application for a home equity line of credit submitted to my bank 11 days before Diane died, listing my name, my property, my signature, which I had never written on any such document in my life. She forged it, I said, and my voice sounded very far away, like it belonged to someone else. It appears that way, Rosalind said. The bank flagged some inconsistencies and put the application on hold pending additional verification, which is likely the only reason it hasn't gone through yet. But Walter, she wasn't trying to borrow against the house to help her family with rent money. Look at the amount she requested. I looked. It was a number large enough to buy a house outright in this market. Not a bridge loan to get a struggling family back on its feet. A number meant to walk away with something permanent. It said, "There's more," Rosalind said, and slid another page across the table. It was a printout from a real estate listing site, a private, invitation-only pre-listing service some agents use to test the market quietly before going public. My house, my address, listed as coming soon, motivated family sale, with photos that had clearly been taken during the 3 days I was gone, my living room already staged with Renee's own furniture instead of mine, my kitchen with the granite countertops I'd installed for Diane's 50th birthday photographed like it already belonged to someone else. She was never planning to live there quietly for a month or two, Rosalind said. She was planning to leverage the house, and if that didn't move fast enough, sell it out from under you entirely, and it said, Leverage AGC, using a power of attorney template we found saved in a shared drive on her laptop. One that named your son as your legal decision-maker due to, and I'm quoting the draft language here, the grieving widower's diminished capacity following his wife's recent death. I sat in that diner booth for a long time without saying anything at all. Diminished capacity. She had been prepared to tell a bank, a courtroom, anyone who asked, that my grief made me unfit to manage my own affairs. She had been prepared to use the worst 3 weeks of my life as a legal weapon against me. I want to press charges, I said finally. Everything. Forgery, attempted fraud, whatever the law allows. That's your right, Arthur said, when I called him straight from the diner. And Walter, given what Rosalind found, I don't think the police are going to call this a family matter anymore. They didn't. 3 days later, I stood on my own front lawn again, but this time I wasn't alone, and I wasn't carrying a suitcase. I had 2 detectives beside me and Arthur a few steps behind, a folder of evidence in his hand thick enough that it needed a rubber band to hold it shut. The same U-Haul trailer was still sitting in my driveway, though most of it had finally been unloaded into my house over the past week like they were settling in for good. The front door was unlocked. It usually was. These days they'd stopped even pretending it wasn't theirs to walk through freely. The detectives went in first. I heard the television shut off abruptly, heard Carol's voice ask sharply who was there, and then I heard the silence that follows when people realize the thing they built is coming apart. Renee was standing in my kitchen, with a stack of moving sale flyers on the counter behind her. I found out later she'd been planning an estate sale for furniture she didn't own, in a house she didn't own, in advance of a closing on a listing that never should have existed. "What is this?" she said, and I watched the same practiced calm from that first terrible night try to settle back over her face and fail. "Danny? What is going on?" Danny came around the corner from the hallway, and when he saw the detectives, when he saw the folder in Arthur's hand, something in his expression finally broke open all the way. Not surprise. Recognition. He had known. Maybe not every detail, maybe not the exact number on the loan application or the phrase diminished capacity typed into a legal template, but he had known his wife was doing something more than moving her parents in for a few weeks, and he had let it happen because it was easier than standing up to her. "Mrs. Higgins," one of the detectives said, "we have a warrant to search this property in connection with a fraud investigation, including a forged loan application and an unauthorized real estate listing filed under your father-in-law's name." The color went out of Renee's face so fast I actually felt something for her. For just a moment, some small, useless flicker of pity, quickly buried under everything else I felt standing in that kitchen. "This is insane," she said. "Walter, tell them. Tell them we were helping. Tell them this is a misunderstanding." I looked at her, and then I looked at my son, who would not meet my eyes at all. "Danny," I said, "did I ever give either of you permission to take out a loan against this house? To list it for sale?" He didn't answer. His silence was the answer. "That's not Danny. Say something," Renee said, her voice rising, cracking at the edges now. "Tell them your father knew. Tell them we talked about this." "I can't," Danny said quietly, and it was the first honest thing I'd heard him say since I walked in the door that first terrible afternoon. "I didn't know about the loan, Renee. I swear to God I didn't know about the loan. Whether that was true, I still don't fully know. I've turned it over more nights than I can count since." End quote. But it didn't matter anymore, not to the detectives, and in that moment, not entirely to me either. What mattered was that my house, the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd built a life with the woman I loved for 31 years, where I'd held her hand while she took her last breath 3 weeks earlier, had nearly been stolen out from under me while I was 3 states away trying to remember how to keep breathing. They took Renee in for questioning that afternoon. Carol and her family, the people who'd never had anywhere else to go, whose crisis had felt urgent enough that first night to make me almost want to be generous about it, packed up what belonged to them in under 3 hours. Nobody argued. Nobody dangled a key in my face or told me I didn't live there anymore. They just left, quietly, the U-Haul trailer pulling out of my driveway one final time, and the house went silent in a way it hadn't been silent since I first walked back into it. Danny stayed behind, standing on the porch steps after everyone else had gone, and for a long moment neither of us said anything at all. "Dad?" he finally managed. "I didn't want any of this. I swear I didn't. I believe you didn't want it to look like this." I told him. "I don't believe you didn't want it at all. There's a difference, Danny, and you're old enough to know what it is." He didn't have an answer for that. I don't think there was one. I walked through the house alone that evening, the way I had walked through it alone so many times since Diane passed, except now the silence felt different. It wasn't the silence of grief pressing down on empty rooms. It was the quiet after a storm has finally moved on, leaving you standing in the wreckage but still, somehow, standing. End quote. I found the photo of Diane still shoved to the back of the nightstand drawer, where someone had put it out of the way instead of throwing it out entirely, a small, strange mercy in the middle of everything else. I set it back where it belonged, in the morning light from the bay window, and I sat on the edge of the bed for a long time, just looking at her face, laughing on that beach, from a life that felt like it belonged to a much younger, much less careful man. The loan application was formally denied and flagged for fraud with the bank's investigative unit. The listing was pulled before it ever reached a public search. Renee was charged with forgery and attempted fraud, and whatever happens in that courtroom in the coming months, it won't happen inside my house, under my roof, while I was 3 states away burying my wife. Danny still calls. I still answer most of the time, though the conversations are careful now, the way conversations are between 2 people who love each other and don't entirely trust each other anymore. He asks how I'm doing. I tell him I'm managing. He doesn't ask to come by, not yet, and I haven't invited him. I think, someday, we'll find our way back to something. He's still my son. That doesn't stop being true just because he stood in a hallway and let his wife tell me the house wasn't mine anymore. But I've learned something these past few weeks that I don't think I ever fully understood in 63 years of living, that grief doesn't just take the person you lost. It opens a door, and if you're not careful, it shows you exactly who's willing to walk through it and take the rest. I still sit on the porch most evenings now, the way Diane and I used to, watching the light go gold and then gray over the same hedge, the same road, the same quiet street. The house is mine again. Truly mine, locks changed, deed secure. Silence restored, the kind of silence I actually wanted. Not the kind that gets forced on you by people who think your worst days make you weak enough to take from. I am not weak. I buried my wife, and 3 weeks later I stood in my own kitchen and told a room full of strangers to leave my home. Grief bent me nearly in half that spring. It did not break me, and in the end that was the only thing anyone in that house ever really needed to learn about me.